The morning Houston Global opened its glass doors to the quarterly meeting. The marble lobby gleamed with the kind of calm only billion-dollar corporations could afford. Soft light spilled across the polished floor. And somewhere on the top floor, Vivian Houston was already 3 calls ahead of her schedule. At 28, Vivian was the youngest chief executive in the building's history. She moved through the corporate world the way a sharpened blade moved through water. That morning, she wore a tailored black dress with a soft V-neck, her long dark hair falling loose around her shoulders, her heels precise. Nothing about her said mother. Everything about her said command. But hidden in a quiet lounge near the executive suite, a small boy sat with his knees pulled to his chest. 7-year-old Henry Houston wore oversized, noise-canceling headphones. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor. In one hand, he held a worn red plastic square, a fragment from a toy discarded years ago, now precious only to him. He did not speak. He had not spoken to his mother in several years. Vivian had not planned for him to be in the building. The nanny had a family emergency. The driver, who usually took Henry to his therapy center, was caught in traffic, and the only place she could trust him for the next hour was 2 doors down from her own office. She knew how sensitive her son was to new sounds and unfamiliar people. But she had no other choice, and her schedule bent for nothing. From the glass door of her office, she could see him on the small monitor near her desk. Henry had not moved in 20 minutes. A member of her staff had set out soft toys. He ignored them. Vivian watched, his fingers tighten around that red square, and felt something in her chest close as well. Then the morning broke apart. Somewhere on the lower floors, a technician ran a test on the emergency sound system. A synchronization error pushed the volume far past the safe range, and for 3 long seconds, the alarm tore through every hallway in the tower. For most of the staff, it was a jolt. For Henry, it was an earthquake. It dropped the red square. It ripped the headphones off because they had amplified the spike before shutting down. It let out a sound that was not a cry and not a word, something in between, a raw noise that came from a place no one in that building knew how to reach. His small body hit the floor. His hands beat against his own temples. Vivian was out of her chair before the second alarm cycle ended. She ran down the hall in heels not built for running, pushed open the lounge door, and dropped straight to her knees in front of her son. Her staff backed away. Security froze. But she reached for Henry, and he flinched as if she had burned him. "Baby, it's me, Henry, it's Mom." He didn't look at her. He didn't hear her. His whole world had collapsed into the echo of that alarm. Vivian's tailored dress twisted under her knees. Her hair fell forward, undone. She tried again, softer, then louder, then softer. Nothing reached him. For the first time in front of her employees, the woman who could silence a boardroom with a single glance looked like a mother who had no idea how to save her child. She did not know how long she had been kneeling there before she became aware of the small crowd at the edge of the lounge. Assistants. Security. 2 visitors who had wandered in from the wrong elevator. They were all trying not to stare. That was almost worse than if they had. Vivian's life had taught her to handle every kind of scrutiny except this one. She had inherited the company at 24, 3 months after her father died of a stroke without warning. The board had doubted her. The press had waited for her to crack. She did not crack. Within 2 years, she had turned Houston Global into a name no one questioned. But Henry was a country she had never learned to enter. When he was small, he had said a few simple words. He had smiled at certain songs. Then something happened in the year her father died, a cluster of losses and small cruelties, and Henry began to fold inward. The words thinned. By the time he was 5, silence had become his first language. She had done everything a mother with money could do. The best specialists. The softest classrooms. Every appointment was logged. Every small progress was counted like a quarterly target. And that was the trap she had not seen closing around her. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped being Henry's mother and started being his project manager. She walked into every room where he sat and asked the silent question, "Did we gain ground today?" Henry felt the weight of that question, even when she never spoke it out loud. And the more she measured him, the further back he stepped. So when the alarm tore through the building and Henry collapsed on the marble floor of her own company, Vivian was watching the proof of her greatest private fear. All her resources, all her authority, all her ferocious love, and none of it could reach him. She could command a room of 30 investors, and she could not command her own child to look up at her. Her tears came quietly, the way grown-up tears come, without sobs, just a slow heat sliding down her cheeks that she kept pretending she could wipe away. And it was in that moment, with her son curled on the floor and her staff frozen around her, that a man stepped quietly into the lounge and did not move too fast. Flynn Mercer was 29, tall, broad in the shoulders, with dark brown hair cut short and a face that had learned long ago not to show too much at once. He wore a navy work shirt with the name of his contracting company stitched above the pocket. His boots were old but clean. He had come to Halston Global that morning to fix the very problem that had just shattered the lobby. A synchronization bug in the emergency audio system. A routine job. The only thing unusual about his morning was the small girl walking beside him. 6-year-old Bonnie Mercer, in a pale yellow dress and white sneakers, held his free hand with both of hers. Her school had called him the night before about an unscheduled staff meeting. The babysitter he trusted most was out of town. So Bonnie had come with him, clutching a stuffed rabbit whose left ear had long since given up its stitching. Flynn had lost his wife when Bonnie was 2. He did not talk about that very often, and never to strangers. What he did was work. He did not think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a man who had something he could not afford to break. When he stepped into the executive lobby that morning, he had meant only to check in with the site manager. Then he heard the first sharp sound of the alarm fail. Then he heard a different sound under it, a muffled, broken, high noise coming from the lounge on his right, and every instinct from a life he did not usually speak of snapped into place. It told Bonnie, in a voice he kept quiet and level, to sit on the small couch in the reception alcove. She nodded. She trusted him completely. Then he walked past the security officer who was still deciding what to do, and stopped at the lounge doorway. What he saw did not surprise him the way it would have surprised most people. He had seen a child like this before. He knew that look. He knew the way Henry's body locked up against its own senses. He knew the clenched grip on the small red object that had fallen by his shoe. He knew that rushing in with open arms was the single worst thing any stranger could do in that moment. So he did not rush. He stood at the doorway and watched Vivian try, and fail, to draw her son back to her. He watched a room full of qualified adults stand helpless because none of them had the one key that mattered here. Then, slowly, he knelt down. Not next to Henry. Several steps away. He lowered his tool bag without letting it thump. He made himself smaller than he was, the way a tall man will when he does not want to seem like a threat. And for the first time since the alarm had shattered the morning, the noise in the lounge began to change. Flynn did not speak right away. He let the silence between himself and Henry settle. He let his own breathing, slow enough that anyone watching closely could almost count the pauses. Vivian, still on her knees, noticed. She did not understand what this stranger was doing, but she knew he was not reaching. She felt some small, wary part of her ease. Henry had not looked up. His hands still pressed against the sides of his head. But the beat of his fists had slowed. Flynn lowered his voice until it was barely above a hush. It's okay, Henry. The red door means you're still safe. For a breath, nothing happened. Then Henry's hands fell away from his temples. Not quickly. Not all at once. The left hand first, sliding down along his cheek. Then, the right. His breath came in a long shudder, as though something inside him had just unclenched a finger it had been holding too long. And slowly, with the hesitation of a child climbing out of a deep well, Henry Halston lifted his head. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Flynn. His eyes, red and wet and wide, stayed on the stranger as if he were afraid that if he blinked, the stranger might stop being real. Tears slid down his cheeks. They were not the wild tears of a boy in a meltdown. They were the quiet, staggered tears of a child who had just heard something he thought he had lost forever. Vivian forgot to breathe. She watched her son, who had not met a stranger's eyes in 3 years, fix his gaze on a man in a navy work shirt. She watched his shoulders loosen. And she heard again, in her head, the phrase the man had whispered. The red door means you're still safe. It was not a phrase anyone in her company knew. It was a phrase that belonged to a place she had buried. A place she had tried very hard to forget, because remembering it hurt more than she could afford. And this stranger had spoken it as if he had carried it in his pocket for years. Flynn did not move closer. It did not try to touch Henry. He only continued, in the same low, careful voice, "You're safe. Nobody's moving you. Take your time." Henry's chest rose and fell. The red square had rolled near his knee. A staff member brought a soft blanket and placed it, at Flynn's almost invisible nod, just within the boy's reach. Henry did not pick it up, but he did not push it away either. That was more than he had done with any new object in months. Vivian rose on legs that barely remembered how. She smoothed her dress with a trembling hand. She stared at Flynn, as if he had become a riddle she had to answer before her heart would beat again. "What?" she said, and stopped, and started over. "What did you just say to my son?" Flynn met her eyes. He did not look proud of himself. He looked, if anything, as though something old had caught up with him. "Ma'am," he said, quietly, "I don't think this is the place." She nodded. Her voice, when it came, surprised her with its steadiness. "My office." In 20 minutes. The office at the top of Halston Global was the kind of room designed to remind anyone who entered it exactly where they stood. Floor-to-ceiling glass. A distant city below. A single long desk in pale oak. No photos. No softness. When Vivian sat behind it, the whole city of light and ambition seemed to arrange itself around her shoulders like a second dress. Flynn was shown in by a quiet assistant. He had left Bonnie with a kind receptionist who had promised to keep an eye on her. Here. He did not stare around the room. He did not try to match its weight. He simply stood in front of the desk and waited. Vivian let the silence hold for several seconds. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you fixed a sound system this morning. That is what your company sent you here to do." "Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then tell me how you happen to know a phrase that only a very small number of people have ever heard." Flynn did not answer immediately. She watched him weigh something behind his eyes. "Mr. Mercer, I am going to ask you directly. Are you a journalist?" "No." "Are you employed by a competitor, an investor, or a publication interested in my family?" "No, ma'am." "Did someone pay you to approach my son?" "No." Her voice cooled another degree. Then how? Flynn's jaw shifted once. I wasn't sure, until I heard him. And until I saw the red piece on the floor. I had to try. If I was wrong, no harm. If I was right, he needed to hear it. Right about what, Mr. Mercer? He drew a careful breath. Right about who he is. Before she could speak again, the heavy office door swung open a few inches. Bonnie Mercer, who had apparently outlasted the receptionist's patience, pushed the door the rest of the way open and walked in with her rabbit under one arm. She stopped halfway across the marble floor. She looked at Flynn. She looked at Vivian. She looked around the office at all the glass and all the sky, and she did not seem especially impressed. "Daddy," she said. "Is the boy okay now?" The air in the office changed in a way Vivian had not been prepared for. A woman who had spent 10 minutes preparing a cold interrogation found the cold suddenly leaving her, chased out by one small, honest sentence spoken by a child who did not know any other way to ask. Flynn knelt down to Bonnie's level. "He's resting, honey. Is he going to be scared again? Maybe? But we're going to try to help him not be." Bonnie considered this with the seriousness of a small person making an adult decision. Then she nodded and walked over to the corner chair and climbed into it. She hugged her rabbit. She just sat. Vivian looked at that child for a long second and felt something unlock in her she had not asked to open. When she spoke again, her voice was not the voice of a chief executive. It was thinner. It was younger. "Please," she said, and the word came out strange in her own mouth, because she had not said it in a long time. "Please tell me where you learned what you said to my son." Flynn did not sit. He stood where he was, his hand resting lightly on the back of Bonnie's chair, and he began. "My older brother," he said. His name was George. Vivian's face did not change. But behind her face, something very quiet broke. George worked at a small center on the edge of the city several years ago. It wasn't famous. It was a little clinic that took children who didn't fit into the usual boxes. Children who came in tense. Children who didn't speak. Children who needed people who could wait. He paused. He was not telling a story for effect. He was telling it the way people tell true things. George wasn't a specialist. He was a volunteer who happened to have patience the way some men have strong hands. He learned what mattered to each child. For some, it was color. For some, it was rhythm. For one little boy, it was a door. "A red door," Vivian said. "Yes, ma'am." There was a small quiet room at the back of the building. The door was painted red. George was the one who repainted it that summer. He told that boy, again and again, every time the world got too loud, the same thing. "The red door means you're still safe." Vivian's hand rose to her mouth. "My brother talked about that boy sometimes," Flynn said, "not in a way that broke anyone's privacy. He never used last names. He just said there was a quiet boy who didn't use words yet, but who understood more than anyone thought. He said the boy's mother was young and tired, and that she was one of the bravest people he had ever seen. Somewhere above the city, a siren passed and faded. George did," Flynn said, "about 3 years ago. A car lost control on the bridge, coming back from the center. He was driving home. He was 31. Vivian's eyes closed. She remembered the phone call. She remembered the coffee cup she had been holding. She remembered how the coffee had not moved, because her hand had stopped moving, and she had just stood there listening to someone explain something that could not possibly be true. She had known George. She had known him better than anyone at her company understood. In the year after her father died, when she was bleeding from every direction, and Henry was slipping away from her word by word, she had taken him to that small clinic under a different name, because she had not wanted the press to find her child. George had been the one who had first gotten Henry to relax his shoulders. He had invented the red door. He had sat, on a rainy afternoon, across from Vivian and said gently, "You are allowed to be tired. It doesn't make you a worse mother." She had never been able to say, out loud, what he had meant to her. He had died before she could. After his death, Henry's language had stopped almost entirely. She had buried that year so deeply that she had believed her son no longer remembered any of it. That the red door had faded out of him the way chalk fades off a sidewalk. That George was a ghost whose last footprints had been washed away by rain. And here, on the marble floor of her own lobby, a child she thought no longer remembered anything had lifted his head for a stranger who had spoken a sentence that only one man had ever said to him. Henry had remembered. Henry had carried it, silent, for 3 years. Henry had never forgot. "My brother," Flynn said softly, "would have wanted him to know that he still counts." Vivian lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked at Flynn for a long time. The city behind her kept shining. It did not seem to notice anything at all. She did not go back behind her desk. She walked to the tall window and stood with her back to the room, because if she stayed where her reflection could watch her, she was going to lose whatever was left of her composure. "I never told anyone at this company," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "About that year, about him. I understand. I kept it out of the record. I paid the center in cash. I wore a different name." "I know, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am." There was a small silence. "Vivian." She pressed her forehead briefly against the glass. "It was cool." It was the only honest thing in the room. "He was the first person who didn't ask me to be stronger," she said. "He didn't tell me to push through. He just sat with us. He made Henry laugh, once, you know. Once, the whole year. I thought I was dreaming." "It told me about that laugh," Flynn said. "It told me it sounded like a bell underwater." Vivian made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. She turned back to face the room. Her eyes were wet. She did not try to hide them anymore. She looked at Flynn, the way a person looks at someone who has just handed back a piece of their life that they thought had been stolen forever. "After he died," she said, "Henry stopped. He stopped saying the few words he had. He stopped looking at people in the eye. I thought it was the autism. I thought it was trauma. I thought it was me. But he never said the phrase again. Never. Didn't ya?" And I thought that meant he had forgotten. "Children don't forget," Flynn said. "They just don't always have the key to the room." She closed her eyes. "I have done everything," she said. "I have hired the best people. I have scheduled every minute. And I have not, in 3 years, been able to give him back the feeling your brother gave him in 3 months. You love him." "Well, I love him so much, it scares me. That's why it hasn't worked," Flynn said quietly. "Not the love, but the fear. You've been walking into his room every day with a checklist. He feels it. Every single time." The words should have cut her. They did cut her. But they cut in a clean place, the place where she already knew the truth and had not been able to say it to herself. She nodded, slowly. "He doesn't need someone to pull him out," Flynn said. "He needs someone who can sit long enough that he knows there's somewhere to come back to." A small sound came from the corner. Bonnie had slid out of her chair and was walking, quietly, across the office carpet. She carried her rabbit with her. She stopped at the edge of the window beside Vivian and held the rabbit out. "For the quiet boy," she said. "If he gets scared again, he can borrow it." Vivian took the rabbit with both hands as if it were made of glass. She knelt down. She was not ashamed anymore that her staff might see her kneeling. "Thank you, Bonnie. You're welcome." They agreed on terms that same afternoon, in a way neither of them had expected. Vivian offered a proper arrangement, a consulting fee, a formal contract. Flynn declined all of it. He said he would come by after work, twice a week, for a few weeks. He said he would bring Bonnie only if it helped. He said he would stop the moment it began to hurt Henry. He laid down conditions of his own, slowly, like a man setting stones across a stream. No cameras. No videos. No recording of any kind. No pressure on Henry to speak. No audience. No test. No reward system. No goal that anyone, including Vivian, was allowed to attach to a single session. She agreed to all of it without arguing. That was perhaps the biggest change in her of the entire morning. The first week was small. Flynn sat across the room from Henry and fixed a little white noise machine that played the sound of soft rain. He never called Henry by name unless Henry looked up first. Bonnie sat on a cushion on the floor with a stack of drawing paper. She drew a lot of rabbits. She did not try to get Henry's attention. She hummed a little, sometimes, when she was concentrating. Henry did not speak. He watched. That was the whole change at first. He watched. In the second week, Henry let the borrowed rabbit stay on the arm of his chair. He did not hold it. He did not move it. But he did not knock it off either. Vivian, watching through the glass from her office, pressed her knuckles against her lips so that no one would see the sound that came out of her. In the third week, Henry did not flinch when the door opened for Flynn. His shoulders did not lock. Vivian was the one who had to learn the hardest thing. Every part of her wanted to ask Flynn after each session whether Henry had improved, whether the minutes had been productive, whether the trajectory was correct. She had to sit on her own hands. She had to remind herself that a child was not a forecast. Flynn caught her Ansa standing outside the quiet room with her hand on the doorknob, about to go in with a question she had not quite formed. "Vivian," he said gently. "Whatever you're about to ask him, ask yourself instead. If you still wanted to ask him after that, we'll talk." She did not open the door. By the end of the fourth week, something unexpected happened. Vivian began to sit in the room too. Not every session. Not for long. But she began to let herself be present without a clipboard, without a phone, without a plan. She did not speak to her son. She did not reach for him. She simply sat. It was the hardest thing she had done in 3 years. It was also, she began to understand, the first thing she had done for him in 3 years that was not about fixing him. Henry, from across the room, began to glance in her direction a little more often. Never for long. Never obviously. But the glances came. Bonnie Mercer did not know she was healing anyone. She was 6 years old, and she had a rabbit with one good ear, and she had a father who let her bring the rabbit everywhere. That was the extent of her plan for the world. She did not ask Henry what was wrong with him. She did not ask him to play. She did not lean into his face. She did not say the one thing every well-meaning adult had said to him for years, the bright, sunny, crushing, "Hi Henry, can you say hi?" She just came in, and she sat down. One afternoon, she dropped her rabbit by accident. It slid across the carpet and stopped by Henry's foot. She started to get up. Flynn, from the other side of the room, lifted a hand. Bonnie stopped. For almost a full minute, nothing happened. The rabbit lay on its side. Henry did not look at it. Then, without any sound at all, Henry bent down, picked it up with both hands, and set it gently near Bonnie's knee. Bonnie said thanks. Henry did not answer. But he did not look away either, not for a full 2 seconds. Vivian, in the corner, was not breathing. From then on, Bonnie and the rabbit, and Henry, and his little red piece, existed in the same room the way 2 small planets might share a sky. not touching, not orbiting, just present. Fingered. Henry began to tolerate sounds he had not tolerated in years. The faint scratch of a crayon on paper. Flynn's low murmur as he talked to Bonnie about dinner. The world, in that one room, had stopped being an assault on his ears and had started being something like a blanket. One evening, Vivian asked Bonnie, without thinking, "Do you want Henry to talk to you?" Bonnie looked up from her drawing. She thought about it seriously. Then she said, "No. I just want him to not be scared when we're here." Vivian could not, for a long moment, answer at all. Grown-ups, she realized, wanted big outcomes. Children wanted simple ones. And in that gap, somehow, most grown-ups forgot what a child's heart was for. That night, after Flynn and Bonnie had gone home, Vivian sat by Henry's bed for a long time. She simply put her hand near his on the blanket, palm up, open, without touching him. She did not move it, even when her arm began to ache. In the dim light, Henry turned his wrist slightly. His small hand did not land on hers. It did not have to. It rested close enough that the warmth reached across the space between them. Vivian's face was wet before she realized she had been crying. The breakthrough did not come on a day anyone had marked on a calendar. It was a late afternoon in the middle of the week. A soft rain fell against the windows of the east wing of Halston Global. Flynn had finished his work for the day, a small maintenance job on the audio panel in the quiet room. Vivian had stepped away from her computer to say goodbye. Henry sat by the window, his red square resting in his lap, his eyes on the water sliding down the glass. Bonnie was already halfway to the door when she stopped short. "Daddy," she said. "I forgot Rabbit." Flynn smiled. "Go get him." She turned and ran back across the carpet. She scooped the rabbit off the low bookshelf where she had left him. She turned to run back. Flynn, at the door, called gently, "Bonnie, time to go." Vivian saw it first. Henry had looked up. His eyes had moved from the window to the rabbit, to the small girl in the yellow sweater, to the man standing in the doorway. His mouth had opened very slightly. His breath had caught. Something had shifted in his face that Vivian had not seen in 3 years, a specific shift, a wanting shift, a please stay shift. Flynn saw it too. He did not move. Nobody breathed. In the long second that followed, the only sound in the room was the rain. Then Henry's small voice, rough, cracked at the edges, quiet as breath, said a word. "Bonnie, gone." Bonnie stopped. Vivian's hand rose to her mouth. Henry's voice came again, trembling, barely there, and this time it was two. "Bonnie, wait." Flynn did not move. Bonnie did not squeal, or jump, or throw herself across the room. Some deep, careful part of her already understood that what was happening was fragile. She only turned fully, slowly, and held the rabbit against her chest. "Okay," she said. Henry's whole body was shaking. Not from fear. From the size of what had just passed through him. Tears spilled down his cheeks in a clean line. He kept his eyes on Bonnie as if to confirm she was still there. As if the simple act of looking was the only way to keep her from disappearing. Vivian stepped forward. Slowly. She did not run to him. She did not grab him. She knelt, near him, not touching, not hovering, just present. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said. Her voice was thick. "I'm right here." Henry did not look at her yet, but his shoulders, which had been rising with each breath, began to settle. It was not, on the surface, a dramatic scene. A boy had said a girl's name. A boy had said the word wait. For most children, Those were the first scribbles of language, long outgrown by 7. But for Henry Halston, who had lived inside a closed room of himself for years, that small request was the first time he had reached out with words to keep someone from going away. He had chosen connection. He had chosen to hold on. Flynn, from the doorway, cleared his throat quietly. "We can stay a little longer, buddy, if you'd like." Henry did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was in his face. In the weeks that followed, the world did not turn into a fairy tale. Henry did not start speaking in full sentences. He did not suddenly talk to his mother about his feelings. He remained sensitive to noise. He remained careful with people. He remained, in the deepest sense, himself. But the silence he lived in was no longer sealed. A week after the rainy afternoon, Flynn asked him if he wanted the sound machine turned down, and Henry answered with a small, rough yeah. 10 days later, when a door slammed somewhere on the floor, Henry looked up at Vivian and let slip, before he could stop it, the word mom. She did not pretend she hadn't heard it. She simply said, back to him, as naturally as she could, "I'm here," and let him go quiet again. Each word was small. Each word mattered. Vivian did not stop being a chief executive. She still moved through her building with command in her heels. She still silenced boardrooms with a look. But the second life she had been hiding, the mother life, the tired life, the life she had been so afraid of letting anyone see, began to sit more comfortably on her shoulders. She cut her calendar on Tuesdays and Thursdays to be home before dark. She stopped scheduling therapies, like business meetings. She learned to sit in a room with her son and not measure him for progress. She found out, to her surprise, that her son laughed. Not often. Not loudly. But sometimes, when Bonnie said something especially small and serious, a soft sound came out of Henry's mouth that was not a word and was not a cry, and Vivian's whole chest went warm. Flynn did not become a different man. He did not accept a corner office. He did not take a salary from Halston Global. He kept fixing audio systems and emergency alarms across the city. But he began to spend certain evenings at the Halston home, sometimes fixing nothing at all, sometimes just sitting at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee while 2 children colored on the floor. He and Vivian did not rush. They had both seen what rushing cost. What grew between them grew slowly, like something planted in fall that does not show itself until spring. It was respect first, then ease. Then a quiet, steady warmth that did not need to announce itself. One evening, many months after the morning of the alarm, Vivian stood at her kitchen window and watched Henry and Bonnie on the small balcony. Bonnie was pointing at something in the sky. Henry was listening. His red square was in his lap. The rabbit, now permanently his, sat beside him. She felt Flynn come up behind her. He did not touch her. He simply stood, as he always stood, close but not crowding. "Thank you," she said, without looking at him. "You did most of it," he answered. "No," she said. "Your brother did most of it. I think about him every day. So do I." On the balcony, Henry turned his face toward Bonnie and said quietly, in his still hesitant voice, a full sentence, "I like the clouds." Bonnie beamed. "Me too." Vivian did not cry this time. She only smiled, with her hand on the edge of the counter, and she thought of a red door, painted by a man she had loved in a way she had never found words for, and she understood at last that love does not vanish because it is not spoken. It simply waits. It waits for the right person, the right moment, the right kind of safety, to call it back into the open. And when it comes back changed, and gentler, and somehow more true than it was before.